Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association. One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm. Fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battle-Born Progress. Yes, thank you for joining us. Just like always on your Thursday evening at 5 p.m., we have some amazing guests this evening who are going to talk all about Nevada's slew of ballot initiatives. I mean, just a slew of ballot initiatives that have dropped over the past couple of weeks. And most of them make no sense at all, or things that we've already done. So we're going to talk about all of that and more. You all can ask your questions at home. We want you to ask questions about these ballot initiatives because you need to understand what is on the ballot in 2022. So today we are joined by some amazing guests. I'm so excited to have these folks. Our returning guest, Brian Rippett, who is the president of the Nevada State Education Association. Brian, thanks for joining us. We have Noe Orozco. He is the Census and Redistricting Coordinator for Silver State Voices. I think I just butchered your last name, Noe, so I apologize. You can correct me after we're done. And then we also have Sammy Ramich, and she is the voting rights attorney for the ACLU of Nevada. So we are excited to have all three of our guests. Noe, thanks for returning to us. You probably won't ever come back again now that I've butchered your name. And then Sammy, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for being here. So Sammy, I actually want to start with you. You know, the ACLU has had a big win. They just had a big win in North Las Vegas, getting a judge to order an election for a municipal court position. Tell us how that happened and what was the result and what does it mean for municipal elections going forward? We want to start with a win tonight before we get into all this other mess.
First of all, thank you, Annette, for having me on the show. I think the discussion tonight is something that needs to be had, especially given the upcoming election that we're having here in Nevada. But to answer your question, that was a huge win for us. In that case, the city of North Las Vegas, they passed an ordinance that essentially created a new department. And at that time, they appointed Judge Lee to that seat for 6 years without holding an election. This was a clear violation of the city's charter, which allows them to appoint a judge. It does allow them to do that. However, that judge must run at the very next election cycle. And in this case, it would be 2022 this year. The judge agreed with us and they ordered that the election had to be held for that seat this year. And I think it's a huge win. And I think it highlights the importance of the fact that the residents, not politicians, decide who serves as judges in their communities. And I think that's a very important thing that needs to be highlighted.
Couldn't agree more. And I'm glad that y'all won that fight because it was really important. And we'll come back to you about more on the ballot initiatives, but I wanted to get that exciting win in before we started our conversation. One other thing I want to make sure we get in before we start. The last time we saw Noe, we were working together on redistricting up in Carson City. Noe, we had a big fight on our hands. Unfortunately, it didn't all go the way we wanted, but some of it did. So tell us where we're at in Nevada with redistricting and that process. And when do the new maps become final for all the different levels of government? Because I know you all have been working on that very hard at Silver State Voices.
Yes, well, again, just like Sammy, I would like to say thank you, Annette, for having me on this show. And in terms of the redistricting process and the redistricting maps, the process is over. The legislature had there was a special legislative session in November that lasted 5 days. And the state legislature approved the congressional and the state legislative maps. And the governor signed them on the same day that the legislature passed in. And so that whole process is basically done. And the maps became effective on January 1st of this year. And there is, though, a small little caveat there, which is that there's one lawsuit, at least one lawsuit. And so, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that if you would like. But that could potentially, depending on if a judge were to hear it out, it could potentially throw the election a little out of whack.
Yeah, let's talk about that lawsuit, Noe. Update the viewers on that. So we really haven't done a redistricting update since November. So before we get into the ballot initiatives, I do think it's important to talk about this because it changes who you're voting for. It changes who your representatives are. I know, personally, my state senator changed. So what does it look like for you or for the rest of the communities and what should they be watching for?
Sure. So the lawsuit was filed by two individual residents from Nye County. One of them is a former Nye County commissioner. One of them is an assemblyman right now. But the lawsuit was filed as on his individual capacity, not as an assembly member. And basically, their argument was that these lines were drawn and that they were partisan gerrymandering. And for those who may not remember so many months ago in terms of gerrymandering, it's basically just creating district boundaries so that it can create an advantage for an individual, for a political party, or for a group of people. And so that was essentially what they had said that was at issue. They were actually also saying that I believe free speech was also a concern that they had. And this lawsuit, like I said, it was filed back in November, and then Elko County commissioners also reviewed it and they ended up signing on. And then there was a couple of individual residents that have signed on, and I believe one resident from Reno. And all these individuals that have signed on to it, they all are, I believe, to my knowledge, registered as Republicans. And they're basically saying that the maps were drawn in a partisan way. So if a judge were to hear this out and say, yes, we need to kind of hit the brakes on everything, it could potentially delay the filing deadline, which is what the lawsuit is now saying, the filing deadline. So if you had mentioned that your elected officials changed, but let's say now that I want to run and represent you, I need to know that I am going to be in your district, and the filing deadline for me to submit that paperwork is March 18th. So it could potentially expand that deadline, but I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about at the national level what some other lawsuits have been happening, but that's what's been happening here locally.
Thank you for that, Noe. All right, let's get into the ballot initiative discussion. I'm seeing a couple questions come in specifically for Noe. We'll get to those at the end, so thank you for that. If you all have questions about anything we're talking about tonight, put them in the chat, either on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch. We will get to you in just a little bit. We will be taking questions at the end. Any questions are welcome, so make sure that you're putting them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the show. All right, Brian, I want to bring you in. You and I and our friends and family over at the NSEA, along with ACLU and a bunch of other progressive coalition partners, have taken on the issue of vouchers head on for years now. Yes, they love to call these things education savings accounts, which is garbage. It's a voucher. Like, let's call it what it is. It's a freaking voucher. So a new ballot initiative has been filed that would bring back these education savings accounts, aka vouchers, and basically defund Nevada schools. Like, this is the whole thing that a voucher does, is to defund or redirect money away from public schools. So who's driving this nonsense, and why are we trying to put it on the ballot since these people clearly can't make anything happen at the legislature?
Right. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Annette. There's a long history of this. As you mentioned, back in 2015, there were some measures that were passed in the legislature for education savings accounts. People woke up and realized by the next session, these are no good. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be taking money out of public schools. And then, so they were defunded, and then basically ended in the last session or two. Who's behind it? Officially, there is Education Freedom for Nevada. And doesn't that sound great to have education freedom? Anytime you wrap something in or around the word freedom, it sure is hard to argue, because that pulls at us emotionally. And that's the intent. It is the intent to say freedom and parents, and then the word choice. Who doesn't like a choice? You know, we're in the land of buffets here. Everybody likes a choice, but it's really used to manipulate us emotionally, so we can not focus on the actual students and the communities that need education in our schools.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit and really educate our viewers. So education savings accounts, vouchers, is something that has been promoted by the right wingers, to essentially privatize our public schools so that they can make money off of our public schools. I mean, this is a Betsy DeVos Koch brothers scheme to privatize our public schools. Am I off?
Yeah,
base?
you're not far off. You're actually right on target there. So the scheme or schemes, they actually predate our knowledge of the name Betsy DeVos. Koch brothers have been around for a while, raising this sort of anti-society measures and ideas. And so it is a scheme to defund or divest from public schools. There is a true movement to privatize public schools, and essentially, whether in reality or in the public consciousness and the dialogue, demonize public schools as failing and educators as, not doing their job. When we know that we have our own beloved public schools in the schools that we went to. So it's similar to the general question of, do you approve of Congress? Heck no. What about your own senator or your own assembly person or your own oh, they're great. And so there's this broad, across the country, schools are failing, but in a lot of ways, my school is good. Now, there are obviously some schools that need more help, and that is, particularly this situation here in Nevada, where we are in, depending on how you look at the rankings, about 48th or 47th or 49th and sometimes 50th of all states in the total money that we spend per kid. And if you spend way less than neighboring states or other systems, we're going to get less. And so we're well on our way to having that label of we fail and we're terrible painted upon us by enemies of society, essentially.
So we just got a question in the chat. I'll just say this one. Who is behind Education Freedom Nevada? I have my suspicions. Is it this usual suspects of Michael Roberson and his, merry band of misfits out there trying to continue to defund this? Because this was Michael Roberson's scheme in 2015. He didn't get it done. Well, he did get it done through the legislature, but then the courts basically overturned it because they said you couldn't be giving private money to,
right. The courts and the
private
electorate by changing who's in charge in Carson City over the last 6 years have taken that away from, this very wild scheme that came. I don't know the involvement of Mr. Roberson. There is a group called Power to Parent. And oh my God, doesn't it feel good for parents to have power? How could we be against that? Another emotional euphemism to get us to think that people are doing the right thing. Most people
Power to Parent also hates trans kids and sex ed. So we know where their agenda is.
Okay, good. No, not that it's good, but it's good that you all are aware of that type of group. And so these are sort of, well, I'll wait for another question before I just go for 20 minutes.
No, go ahead. You go ahead. Just go, okay. Brian.
All right. So there, it's really a big plan to offer coupons to wealthy people or people that want to have a discount for their choice. And what I mean by that is, if Nevada spends about $7,000 per student from state money, and the way that I read this, and these are new, so I haven't had time to fully digest everything in them, but what they're doing is saying we want to give those $7,000 to the parents. Let's empower them to choose how their kids are educated. Most parents don't know how to do that, for one. And then the other part is, if you look at private schooling in Las Vegas, the ones that probably come to mind, if you say, hey, list 5 private schools, they range anywhere from $13,000 up to almost $30,000 a year, actually over $30,000 a year. So you're going to get 7 and go ahead and enroll your kid at one of these schools, but it's going to cost you 14 just for tuition. That doesn't count fees. That doesn't count getting them there. That doesn't count anything else. So really, what are the types of I don't want to say it that way, what families are truly going to be able to take advantage of this and enroll their kids in some of these top private schools? Very few. Most folks that aren't really wealthy would not be able to. So it's a $7,000 coupon or a Groupon, buy one, get one free for some of these schools. And it's, it's a 25% off coupon at best for the Meadows. I mean, it's maybe a 20% off coupon for the Meadows. So it's a bunch of BS, really, is what it is in terms of fighting for kids. Another thing I want to say, so I get it in, is these groups will find emotional, heart-wrenching, specific stories of a child or a family that was saved by such a program. So we got to beware. We have to make sure that we know we're going to bring out some folks, and these individual students may have been helped, and somehow the family found a school that they could get their kid in for $7,000 or less, or they got outside funding, or they got a scholarship. But that is so rare compared to the general population. And this is not about saving one child, helping one family. This is about our mission at NSEA to ensure a great public education for every student in Nevada. It's about every kid. It's not about the child of the power to parent group. It's not about one person. So if every kid can't benefit, then we should not be doing it as with public dollars.
I'm a taxpayer. I don't have any children. I still want our public education system to be strong because
you don't believe in freedom and
well, right. But also, my mom, she is an office manager at the elementary school that I went to, which is a public elementary school. And, I see her having to fundraise online to buy basic necessities because she's at a Title I school and her kids need extra help. I'm sorry, my tax dollars should be going to that, not rich kids going to a private school.
I agree with you, Annette.
Weird. All right, Sammy, I want to bring you in on this question. Again, the ACLU has done a lot of work on this issue with us over the past couple of years. So, Sammy, what constitutional problems are there with school vouchers that funnel public money into private schools? And can this money end up going to religious schools? Or maybe schools that are anti-LGBTQ or anti-disability or what have you?
So I want to hit a little bit on what Brian said. He indicated back in 2015 when we had sort of the same issue. And I think we can look back when specifically 2 cases were filed at that time. It was one of the cases was led by Educate Nevada Now, and that was Lopez v. Schwartz. And then the other was led by us, the ACLU of Nevada, and that was Duncan v. Nevada. And although they were a little bit slightly different lawsuits, but inevitably it kept the voucher program that the legislature had passed in 2015 from moving forward. Both of these cases went up on appeal and addressed the unconstitutionality of having these voucher programs. And the Nevada Supreme Court ruled that the statute creating, as you said, the education saving accounts, which they're doing very similarly here, violated the state's constitution. And because the Nevada state constitution prohibits funds that are allocated to public education for being used for any other purpose. So essentially what they said was that the funding mechanism that was being used by these voucher programs, if you wanted to have it, you had to find a different way to fund it. And I think you hit a big point on this money going to religious schools. In our case specifically, we did address and argue that these voucher programs do violate the separation of church and state. Unfortunately, the Nevada Supreme Court didn't overturn the voucher program based on that. But I think whether or not this is constitutional, we still have that issue of these funds are going to religious schools. Inevitably, that's what's going to happen. And those schools do discriminate between students who are LGBTQ, students with disabilities, and that's an issue. And we cannot have that. So I think it's just a repeat of what has happened in 2015, I think, in this instance.
Yeah, I think this is just you're seeing a lot of stuff end up on the ballot right now. I think this is just their sad grasp at trying to maintain control of this stuff. And I just don't think it's going to work, but we'll have to see. And, we'll be ready if it does. All right, Sam, I'll come back to you in just a second. So Noe, I want to bring you in this week, and actually I'm going to ask that question in a minute. I want to talk about ballot questions first. So recently there have been ballot question petitions filed for a number of election related things. An independent commission for redistricting, which I have a lot of opinions about, ranked choice voting and final five voting, voter ID, repealing Assembly Bill 321, all kinds of nonsense around voting. So let's take these in order of the way I just listed them, and we'll kind of go through each one. So the first thing is, let's talk about an independent commission. And if the independent commission question were to make it on the ballot and pass, what would that mean in the context of the redistricting process that Nevada just went through in the future? And what would it mean for communities of interest, which we just talked so much about during the redistricting process? So remind us what a community of interest is first.
Sure. So I think before even jumping to that, it's important to take a step back and talk a little bit about the type of initiative that it is, because and the ones that you just mentioned, there are two different types. So the Redistricting Commission is a constitutional initiative where it's trying to change the Constitution. And we'll talk a little bit about one of the other ones. But essentially what has to happen is that for this to get on the ballot and then to pass, before it even gets on the ballot, it needs to have a certain amount of signatures. And I don't remember how much it is. It's around the number of 35,000. And that's in each congressional district. And so when we added that 3,500, it gets us close to about 140,000 signatures. If it does not get those signatures, then this thing basically dies and it doesn't go anywhere. If we assume that it does get these signatures, it then has to be approved by voters in 2 consecutive elections. So the first one is this one coming up, 2022. Voters have to say, we like it, we agree to it, we pass it. And then in 2024, they have to vote on it exactly the same way, saying, you know what, it wasn't a fluke. We didn't just think it was going to be a one-time thing. And then we end up voting for it again. So if all that were to happen, then what ends up happening as it relates to redistricting, the state legislature is no longer responsible for drawing the congressional and the state legislative maps. And although the ballot initiative would go into effect in 2024, it would not be implemented until 2030, because that's the next time that the census is going to get done. And in 2031 is when we'll be going through the redistricting cycle again. So, it wouldn't be implemented until 2031. Now, as it relates to communities of interest, which you just mentioned, one of the I guess the way that in Nevada, there's no definition for a community of interest. There are a couple of other states that in their constitution or in the way that they're dealing with redistricting, they define what a community of interest is. Here in Nevada, what we do is we have the 2 requirements, which are the federal requirements, and then the state legislature, before redistricting happens, they say we need to approve the rules and the guidelines. And in there, they say we need to ensure that communities of interest are adequate, are not being disenfranchised. And the way that we see the communities of interest is including, but it's not limited to, racial groups, ethnic groups, economic, the social and cultural similarities, as well as geographic and even historical identities. And so one of the things that this ballot initiative does do is that it does provide some form of a description for what a community of interest is. And so that is one of the positives of it. But in terms of the redistricting commission itself, I do feel that there are some shortcomings to it. And that could just be that there is no guideline for are these commissioners going to be compensated? Because in some states they are compensated, in others they are not. It's the leadership in the Assembly and the Senate that is going to appoint some of the commissioners, and then those commissioners appoint others. But it doesn't say anything about what if all these commissioners are actually appointed from Clark County. It still has the issue that this whole lawsuit right now with happening here in the state is they're saying that the rural voices were not being listened to. That was part of the reason that they're arguing. But this commission could essentially do the exact same thing because there are no guidelines, or I should say there's actually very minimal guidelines for, what to do. One of the other big issues that I see with it is it doesn't have a minimum requirement of meetings. It just says, yes, you have to have public meetings where the public has access to these open meeting laws, which is really good and all, but it doesn't say how many meetings will there be, where will these meetings take place. One of the biggest things that our coalition was really pushing for was having at least one public meeting on tribal lands so that they could hear from the tribal communities. And they tried meeting us somewhere down the street, from where that was. Fell a little bit short, I feel, but this commission and this initiative, it still doesn't provide any of that guidance. So that's where we're at with the redistricting ballot initiative.
Yeah. And Noe, just on that one real quick, we are a part of a national organization, Progress Now. That's our national organization. And many of my colleagues in other states have redistricting commissions. And I have to be honest, not one of them have had something good or positive to say about this, because in my opinion, one of the real drawbacks of an independent redistricting commission is they're accountable to nobody, especially not regular people. Now, yes, our legislators essentially ignored us, but there's still accountability there because there's still voting happening. You can still hold your representatives accountable. So for me, has that been part of the discussion on this? And where has that discussion kind of led us, at least here in Nevada?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that Nevadans count and all of our 19, almost 20 coalition partners have not been reached out to in terms of this ballot initiative. There was another ballot initiative in 2019, which was the exact same thing that it's trying to do right now with the commission. And back then, none of our partners were reached out to. So in terms of what some of the concerns that we have, there's that disconnect there. But what I can tell you from my own research, because one of the things that I started thinking about was that there was the federal legislation that was trying to also have commissions. So that got me thinking, if that were to pass at the federal level, how is that going to impact us here in the state? And so I just started looking and seeing the different types of commissions that there are. And there's essentially 4 different types of commissions. There's the independent one, which is what this is trying to do. There's a bipartisan commission, which is the elected officials themselves are the commissioners. Then there is an advisory commission, which is if the legislature screws it up so bad, like Ohio, I believe, then this commission comes in and tries to fix it. And then there is a backup commission, which is the same thing, which works very similar to the advisory commission. So there's those 4 different types, but something that I feel we can talk a little bit more in one of the future questions maybe is that there has been about 25 lawsuits throughout the country with regards to redistricting. And there's a fair amount of them that are the legislature who was responsible for redistricting, but there's also a fair amount where it was actually a independent or a nonpartisan commission that drew the maps. And they still said that they did a bad job at trying to make the districts representative of the communities.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's move to the next one because there's a few on voting rights I want to talk about tonight. So your executive director, Emily Zamora, friend of the show, friend of BBP and IPN, was quoted in the Las Vegas Sun this week talking about the barriers to obtaining an ID to vote for some people. What do you think the concern is if Nevada were to adopt a voter ID scheme? And I use the term scheme on purpose because voter ID is a bad thing, just like vouchers is a bad thing promoted by the exact same people.
Sure. So my boss was quoted, and it essentially what she was saying was, when we're talking about passing a voter ID law, it's something that would discourage a segment of the community from actually participating in the election. And to that, in that same article, there's actually a report, I believe. I'm not sure if it's an actual report or not, but it's from the ACLU. And what it says is that about 18% of citizens over the age of 65 do not have an ID. About 16% of Latinx voters do not have a government issued ID. About 25% of voting age Black voters do not have an ID. and about 15% of voting age Americans who earn less than 35,000 do not have an ID. So if we're looking at, okay, you just have to have this ID and it's going to be the, the saving grace of the election or of an election, we're already seeing who are these individuals that are going to have the challenge to actually being able to acquire an ID. And, even if they were to say, well, you can get it for free because the government is going to help you get that for free, there's still additional costs, right? Where you have to travel to get to and from the location. And there's, varying factors. And one of my colleagues, Matilda, shout out to Matilda, she did a little analysis of it. And essentially, I think it was in about 3 different states that she was looking at where they had done something like what they're proposing to do here. And if we take into account for the inflation, it was about $200, if not more, just to try to get this free ID from the government. And then the last thing that I would say on that is that, the biggest argument that some of the folks that support voter ID, they basically say, that you need an ID to get alcohol or to even go through security at the airport. And, for me, the first thing or the response to that would be that that is not applied equally across the country, across the state, whatever the jurisdiction you're looking at, it's not applied equally. And the perfect example that I can reference is every time that I have to travel through, TSA, I have to take into account that added time for me to be randomly selected every single time that I'm passing through there. And if I'm randomly selected always, then is it really random? Right. So there's a lot of issues with just the fact that you're saying if you need it for all these things, it's going to be equally, across the board.
Well, and I just want to add in, Noe, and then I'm going to bring in Sammy on this. My ability to drink alcohol, drive a vehicle, or go on an airplane is also not constitutionally covered in the United States of America. My right to vote is in the Constitution. I have a right to vote in this country. And so do all of you. And so for me, we should not be making it harder for people to vote. We should be making it easier to vote. And voter ID causes all kinds of barriers at the polls. They will accept an NRA ID in Texas as a valid form of ID, but they won't accept a student ID. Come on, y'all. If you can't see what the right is trying to do here to your voting rights, come on, wake up. That's all I have to say. So Sammy, I want to bring you in on this topic because again, this, my staff is making fun of me because these topics get me really pissed off, whether it's voter ID or vouchers or any of this other nonsense. So Sammy, as the lawyer in the room, I just play one on TV. Voter ID is this nonsense we have seen the right push in Nevada for a very long time. They've tried it multiple times before we've beat it back. Are there legal or constitutional problems with requiring somebody to show ID in order to vote and not just the stuff that I just screamed about?
Yes. So the short answer is yes, most definitely. I think Noe did a great job of highlighting those statistics. And in my opinion, this voter ID ballot initiative is perhaps the most troubling out of all the ballot initiatives that are pushed this cycle. And just to put it frankly, requiring an ID to vote, it makes it harder for Americans to vote. And if you look at it the same way as Noah just pointed out, it impacts communities of color, elders, and those with disabilities the most. And if you look at it, it's very much akin to the Jim Crow era laws where it was basically targeting Black Americans and keeping them from voting. And the Equal Protection Clause, to get to the legal aspect of it, the Equal Protection Clause prohibits laws that place an undue burden on the right to vote. And requiring an ID to vote is an undue burden. Noe, as I said, he did the statistics. If you look at it countrywide, roughly 11% of all Americans don't have an ID. And as he highlighted, this number is even higher for people of color, minorities, and even students. And same way as Noah stated, this is not just about getting an ID. You have a lot of people that say, well, it's easy. You just get an ID, you show it, you vote, and that's all that needs to take place. What people fail to realize, or I think sometimes ignore, is that it's not feasible financially for everyone to get an ID, or it's not feasible for them to obtain the necessary documents for them to be able to get an ID. And those people still have a fundamental right to vote, and you can't take that away from them. And despite the fact, if you look at it constitutionally, requiring ID is unconstitutional in and of itself. And as Noe also highlighted, it has in those states that do have voter ID laws, they are applied discriminatory. You highlighted as well as in Texas, where they allow you to have the concealed weapons permit to vote, but you can't use your student ID to vote. I think there have been also other states, most recently in North Carolina, it was struck down, but they prohibited public assistance IDs and state employee IDs, which were disproportionately held by Black voters. And I think this is not a partisan issue. I mean, democracy truly works if everyone has access to the polls. And voter ID laws greatly undermine the democratic process, and that is at the core of American values. I can't put it any other way. It inhibits people and Americans, especially those minorities, from being able to vote.
I just add something, Annette.
Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
So we're talking about ID, if government issued ID. The county where my home is, we don't have a DMV. How do you get a government ID? With my son who's about to turn 19, he decided not to get a driver's license, but he needed ID. Just getting there is tough. There's no public transportation, and here in Las Vegas, I've seen lines and seen stories about the wait time at DMV. So if you have to take off a full day of work to go on Monday through Friday during those hours and get there and back, the burden is or can be tremendous.
And then
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect example, Brian, of what we're talking about here. Noah, you want to jump in again?
I do, yeah. And then just another point on this government issued ID. In that report that I was looking at, it was showing that in Wisconsin, if you have an active military ID, like you can go ahead and vote. But if you have a VA ID, that they don't allow you to use that as a form of ID. And so, it's not going to be implemented across the board equally, essentially. And then the last thing that I would add is, the report that I was referencing in terms of the cost for getting these IDs, it was, through a Harvard Law School study, and it wasn't like a self-reported 100% report where they basically say, hey, what do you feel? This is a report where they actually did some research as opposed to just saying, let's just ask 100 people and let's determine who those 100 people are so that they can essentially skew the findings.
All right. Thank you for
and
that.
Annette, if I may briefly just jump in.
Please.
No, just personally, I recently, that's what I experienced, just to kind of highlight Brian's point of how difficult it can be. And, I'm lucky enough to have an understanding job and being able to put in the effort. But for me to switch over to a Nevada ID, I went there the first time, stood in line for 4 hours, only to be told, hey, we need this original document. I had to fly somewhere, get that original document, had to fly back, and then stood in line. And I was there for 7.5 hours just to be able to do that. And, it's not feasible for everyone to be able to. So that just, I think personally, experience it personally, and all the other things other people have to face, I think a lot of people don't take that into account.
And it also it's so easy to poo-poo this, right? But for me, again, it's a constitutional right that we have to vote. And I think it's so important to also mention there are all kinds of fail safes that we have for when people register to vote or when people are doing automatic voter registration. We built in all kinds of security measures and safety measures to make sure that process is modern, secure, safe. So adding another layer of ID actually doesn't do anything because all of those other protections are already built into our voting system. It is only there to disenfranchise people. Okay. I'm going to keep getting angry. Like I said, my staff is making fun of me because I'm air chopping the screen now. So no way, let's move to another topic I'm going to get angry about. As a coalition, which we are a part of, SSV, Silver State Voices runs, the Let Nevadans Vote Coalition worked very hard this year to expand the freedom to vote with AB 321, Assembly Bill 321. What does that bill do? Because I think it's important for our viewers to understand why this bill is so important and what is at stake if we turn back the clock and this law gets repealed on the ballot?
Sure. So, I think in terms of the previous question where you were talking about expanding it, AB 321 essentially did just that. It was expanding the accessibility to being able to cast your ballot. And if I could just pause momentarily there and talk about the other type of initiatives. So as I had mentioned, the commission was a constitutional one, and this is a referendum initiative. And essentially what this is going to do is it's still going to require that they receive the same number of signatures so that I can get on that ballot. And what's going to happen, though, is that in 2024, Nevadans would go and vote and say that they want to either keep this in its entirety or to strike out whatever those provisions are. So it wouldn't be, something that we would be voting on this year. It would be in 2024. And essentially what they do not like, the people who are pushing for this referendum, is that they do not like the mail-in voting. And that's the biggest issue that they have with it. And I feel that, when we have voters, when voters have the option to vote in any way that they feel most comfortable, it goes back to the point that Sammy was saying, right? Where it's like that our democracy is stronger and better for it. And so, one of the things that AB 321 was doing is it was allowing for, it was expanding the mail-in voting. Another thing that it was doing is that it was allowing for the mail drop-in boxes. I'm trying to butchering the official name of them, but it was allowing for that. And there's a couple of concerns that some of the other side has been saying, in terms of that. And I was actually coming across an article where it was talking about, essentially, hypothetically, if we were to have a car basically try to run over this mailbox drop-off area, like, it wouldn't do a thing to the box. There was another report that it was talking about where I think in California, someone tried setting it on fire and it essentially didn't do anything, very little is what it did to it. And the fire department had to come and basically use like a chainsaw or a hacksaw or something to try to open it, because that's how hard it was to basically get into it. So this initiative, this referendum, I should say, it's basically just trying to go backwards and to just, close this out. I think it's good to highlight the Boulder City municipal election last year. And so about 57% of the voter turnout, they chose to vote by mail. And so, this is still, I think it's fair to say it's a relatively new thing that, we're still doing here in the state, but it just goes to show that, if voters are given this option, everything that Sammy was talking about and that Brian was talking about in terms of having to go get that ID, now if you have to go stand in line, for X amount of time, if it just is easier for you to go ahead, sit in your kitchen table and start filling everything out and then have it go get dropped off, why are we going to restrict this right that you were mentioning, Annette, in terms of just because a certain segment of the population feels that there is some lack of integrity in the system? And if we're looking at it, they're saying, in order for us to feel secure, this is what you need to do. But even though there is no proven fact or there's no proof that this is wrong, they're still saying we need to feel more comfortable and screw whatever, basically screw your feelings, but don't screw our feelings.
So Sammy, I want to bring you in on this. This is another place where I get very passionate. We work very hard to pass Assembly Bill 321. And in doing so, we weren't doing that for one party over another. All parties use vote by mail. All registered parties have use this to their benefit. Elderly folks have used this. People with disabilities have used vote by mail, especially during the pandemic, which is why all of this started in Nevada, was to give Nevadans additional options to be able to cast their vote. And so they could drop it off, they could vote in person, or they could vote by mail. They have all the options now. Isn't that what we should be doing in the United States? And also, what have you seen in terms of vote by mail around the country being successful or maybe not successful?
I think it goes back to what Noe was just saying, and that these are steps we have taken to give access to people around Nevada and everywhere else in the country, access to the ballot box. And it's not a negative thing to allow people who typically would be deterred or aren't able to make it to the ballot box from having them exercise their fundamental rights. And what it has done, it's allowed us to reach those that typically would say, hey, I have a disability. Getting out of the house on election day will be a problem for me. I don't have someone to drive me up there because I can't drive. They are able to fill that out and they are able to exercise their rights. So I think it's such a great thing that we have taken this step. And I think Nevada can serve as an example to all the other states who are rolling back protections. The fact that we've taken steps towards giving more protections and more access, I think it's a great thing. And this would greatly undermine all the steps we've taken towards this progress.
Right. This is AB 321 and all of the bills that came before that. This is something that Nevadans should be proud of. We should be proud of our voting system in Nevada. We should be proud of all the work that we've done in Nevada to make our voting system modern and secure and accessible to people. So it does. It'll take us backwards and make us the laughing stock of the country if we go backwards. Okay, last one on this, and then Brian, I'm coming back to you to talk more about vouchers. So we'll just get fired up before we wrap up. And reminder for all the folks watching at home, we've got so many people on tonight. We've got over 50 people watching tonight. So thank you for joining us. Thanks on all the different platforms. This is a very popular episode. So keep sharing it, liking it, share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, share it with your friends and family on YouTube. Get it out there because people need to know what's on their ballot this year. So the last one I want to talk about, and this is something that a lot of folks don't know much about, Noe, so you're really going to have to give us the knowledge on this. Ranked choice voting and final five voting would introduce some new concepts to our elections, even new for me. What do you see as the pros and cons of this system, especially for communities of interest? And how are we thinking about this stuff, specifically these ballot measures right now?
Sure. So as you mentioned, it certainly is a brand new concept that would be introduced in the state. And I think, I can try to separate them, but starting with the final five first. And so with the final five, open primary elections would allow is any registered voter, regardless of their political affiliation, would be able to cast a ballot for any candidate for any of the partisan offices. And then it describes there what those partisan offices are. And what they would do is during the primary, they would be able to cast only one vote for whoever that candidate is. And the five candidates that have the most votes are going to go to the general election. And when we get to the general election, it switches to the ranked choice voting. And essentially what you're able to do at that point is it allows all voters the option, it's not requiring you, but it allows you to vote for multiple candidates in a single race in order of your preference. So we got four of us here. Let's say John Smith is the fifth candidate that made it to the general election. I can vote and say that my preferred candidate is me. And then I'm going to choose Annette, and then Sammy, and then Brian, and then the last candidate that I prefer is John Smith. But I'm eliminated in the very first round. I get nobody gets 50% of the vote. So then they start trying to eliminate these candidates. Because I got 5% of the vote, they basically eliminate me. And then it's like, all right, who was Noah's second choice? And then it was Annette. If you get eliminated, and it's like, and then it goes down the list until you finally get a candidate who gets to that 50%. A problem with this could be that John Smith character ends up being the one who nobody really wanted, but because of how you're doing the process of that elimination by the preferred candidate, they could be the ones that end up being elected at the end of the day just because of the way that the process worked. And then there are other issues with it where if I were to say I'm running for office and I get to vote 5 times, cool, I vote for me 5 times. That doesn't count. They would basically invalidate my ballot or my vote, and I basically wouldn't be able, my vote wouldn't be counted, not even once, because there's that requirement that says you cannot be voting for the same person more than one time. And so, there are those issues with it. And as you mentioned, this is a brand new thing that is new, I think, throughout the country as well. I think only 2 states have a statewide system where they have the ranked choice voting. And I believe it's Alaska and Connecticut, maybe Maine, out in the East Coast. But it's only 2 states, right, that have it. And if because I was focusing on all the demographic information during the redistricting, those 2 states are not very reflective of the country. Nevada is the 3rd most diverse state in the country. And we look at Alaska and Maine, even if it's Maine or Connecticut, like, you know, it's not that diverse either. And then in terms of cities, I think San Francisco and New York City also have it, but it's still relatively new. And, you know, so there are still some concerns there. And it would be a very big learning curve, but in the research that I've been looking at, it does show that a lot of communities of color, they if they have the right information, they do tend to favor it. But the problem is that a lot of times they don't have it, and it does get very confusing and convoluted. And it could just serve as another way to deter people from actually voting, because they're like, well, I have no idea, you know, what it is that I'm supposed to be doing on here. So it would be a big burden, and not to say that we wouldn't be able to do it, but it's still something relatively new.
Makes sense. No, I thank you for that. And thank you for that context. It was super important. So I know we have a lot of questions coming in the chat, but Brian, I want to come back to you really quickly, because I feel like I want to kind of wrap it all back around to vouchers. You know, the same people who are running these ballot initiatives on voting and limiting access to voting, i.e. Michael Roberson's firm. So the same right-wingers who are running that stuff are also running this voucher thing. It's all connected, right? Yes, the PAC is underpowered apparent. It's the same people. They're all a bunch of right-wingers. So let me ask you this. If we pass vouchers, education savings accounts, as they're called, what happens to our public education system in the state of Nevada over time?
Well, essentially, it would legalize the theft of public money to put it into private enterprise. In terms of long term, so you immediately take out 20, 40, 60 million. These things always start small, you know, and then they grow over time. And what's often not discussed is the effect on the push and the drive to have a great public school system. So every student you take out that has been, their wish or their need was satisfied. You've taken out students, you've taken out families. They no longer care about the rest of the system. And then you take out some more that get a voucher, and then you have fewer and fewer people that are invested with their students or just in any way into the public school system. So we're left with basically a system that's rotting and no one cares about. You don't have loud, coordinated voices that are going to push for funding at the legislature. So it might get flat funded, and over time it will erode. And quite frankly, Las Vegas would not be a place that anyone wants to move or live, whether you're a business person or, you know, unless you're stuck here, you're going to leave. And that's where we go with this, if you take it closer to the endpoint. And if I might, there was a question from Will P. that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Will basically said, why are people okay with defunding public education, but not okay with defunding police? Now, these are very big and different issues in a lot of ways. But I want to put this out there as an idea. What if I didn't want to participate in the government-run safety and protection enterprise? You know, I want choice in public safety. I want the money that is spent on a per person basis for all of the police, all of the, you know, all the services. I want that to come to me, and I will hire my own. Okay, whether I just hire myself or I hire a private eye for something that may happen. It's ridiculous to think about it that way. We all need to put into the system so we're all participating. And if I opt out of the system, I no longer want to participate in your group that's going to pull me over for speeding. Like, I have my own. I've hired my own person or my own group to take care of that. Okay, so it just becomes more and more preposterous. So we need to think about what would it look like if we did the similar thing to another group, and maybe a group that's near and dear to the hearts of the folks that are trying to divest from public education.
Thank you for that, Brian. So one other question, just to give more context around what happens to education itself. Nevada schools are obviously already woefully underfunded, right, in comparison to many of the other states our size around the country. And how much funding is at risk if you were saying, you know, different levels, but how much funding really is at risk if ESAs, the voucher program, siphon off that revenue to private institutions? Like what money are we talking about in a state like Nevada?
Well, right away, we're probably talking $60 million. That's like year one. But then,
and what is the DSA, the distributive schools account? What is our education budget for the state right now? So in comparison, what does that mean?
It's a lot more than that. So it's easy to say it's not that much. It's not going to hurt. But back to my earlier point, that 60 becomes 120 in the next year, and maybe 240. And then a bunch of charlatans and crazy folks start opening private schools because now it is a free-for-all. I'm going to get $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, and I can have a school, and it's funded by the state. The other part of that is we no longer have folks that care about the public system. And so that's what's going to hurt. It will suppress any improvement or growth in the public system. So it's much more complicated than say, oh, $60 million or $20 million. The original laws back in 2015, and that the amount of money was limited, but there was this guaranteed growth factor that if you put it out over time, it was going to be more than the national debt. If you took it out enough years. And so that's the real issue is don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. It will not be fine. It's going to destroy our public system. And, you know, we won't have an economy or people that want to live here.
That's right, Brian. Okay, thank you for that. We're not done yet. We've got questions coming in on the chat. So thank you for everybody watching. Like I said, we're having a big night tonight. There's over 50 people on all of our different streams on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. So make sure you're sharing this with your friends and family because they need to know some of these dangerous ballot initiatives that are going to be on our ballot in 2022. A lot of good stuff on our ballot in 2022, a lot of important races like the Senate race, the governor's race that are going to be on our ballot in 2022. But now there's going to be a lot of dangerous stuff too. And so we need to make sure that we're talking about that. So I'm going to ask you all a couple of more questions just generally that I have, and then we're going to move to our audience questions. So just hang in there. We're going to go a little over tonight just to get to all of this. So Sammy, I want to come to you. You know, you all run the voter protection hotline during all of our elections. We work with you on that to make sure that voter protection is an important part of all of our election work during these election years. So how is that effort going to look the same this year? And how is it going to look different? Because obviously voter intimidation is a real thing and we need to be vigilant and watching for that across the state.
Yes, Annette. So we are very proud of our election protection program. You can see it behind me, but it's the 866-R-VOTE. That is the number that individuals can call if they have issues or questions regarding voting, especially when it comes to their ability to access the polls. And I think this may tie into one of the questions, if I've seen in the chat, regarding what we can do in terms of intimidation at the polls. That is an point of avenue for people to have to get information on what can be done or to get help if something like this does happen. But the hotline, it doesn't just present a platform for us to answer questions. It also alerts us to issues surrounding voting that may require litigation. And you know, in each election cycle, we've helped hundreds of Republicans, Democrats, nonpartisans get access to the polls. And this year's election protection program, it's going to mimic a lot of what has happened in the previous years. But we have also done a lot to push back against disinformation. And additionally, the affiliate has hired me on as the voting rights attorney, which was a new position that's been carved out to specifically focus on voting rights issues and litigation. So I think those two aspects are a little bit different. But as I said, I think that is a good avenue for people to have access. And in case something does happen, they're not out there alone. They know that there's someone they can go to when they have questions.
Annette,
Yeah, and let's actually
would I be able
hang
to
on
add
one
something? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, hang on one second, Noe. I'm gonna actually ask this question and then you both can kind of jump in on this. So it's a question from Amber and from our audience. And she says, what can we do to protect polling locations? With so much political division and violence, it can be scary to go vote sometimes. Are there any measures that we could work on in the future to make polling places safer? And this is something we also work on in terms of gun violence prevention. It's something I'm very worried about going into this election because we saw the insurrection on January 6th. We saw, folks showing up with guns at county commissioners' houses. This is something I'm very concerned about. And when it comes to the safety of our poll workers, but also intimidation of our poll workers and the safety of just voters of all different backgrounds, right? So Noe, you want to jump in here?
Sure. So, just want to add on to what Sammy was saying, and in response to that question that Amber asked. So Sammy did mention that the ACLU, in coordination with Silver State Voices, that they work with that nonpartisan election program, and that's in Clark and Washoe counties. And essentially within this program, everyday Nevadans are able to come together to help protect the vote in Clark and Washoe counties in the primaries and the general elections. And so what it does is that these individuals, they go through a training and then they serve as the eyes and ears on the ground, that if there are those issues, they can contact that chain of command, how they go through the training, and say, hey, at this polling location, this is the experience, this is the issue that they're having. And so any issues or concerns, they're able to resolve it. And when they contact their appropriate person, they can even end up reaching out to the registrar's office saying, hey, this is the issue that we have. So the ACLU and Silver State Voices, they have pretty good relationships with both of the registrars and the counties. And so the other thing that we do, whenever they have those long lines, we also provide them water, sunscreen, some snacks and all that. I know that there's an issue in other states, with what's going on with that, but that's, again, another way that we're really trying to help and ensure that these individuals are able to cast their constitutional right to vote. Now, in terms of the measures, I don't know if Amber was referring to any specific legislative measures or just actions that everyday Nevadans can take. And if so, if one of your team members would be able to post in the chat, the sign up, if they are interested, that would be great, a great way for them to get involved.
Cool. Sammy, anything else on that?
Yeah, I think Noe did a good job of highlighting what can be done. Obviously, with the 866R vote, that does kind of alert us to the questions that people are having. But I think I would like to emphasize that even with that, if there's issues in the polling places through this hotline, we will be kind of put on alert of whether or not we need to take legal action to remedy what is going on. And I know it's the fact that we're having intimidation at the polls and it's preventing people from being worried about voting and feeling safe. And I know that's uneasy and that shouldn't be happening at all. But I think one of the good things that we do have, especially with the bill that was passed, is that the automatic mail-in ballots are being sent to everyone. So if they don't feel comfortable with going to a polling location, they can just fill it out by mail and send it in. And I know sometimes people feel more comfortable going to the poll, but that's also an option.
Thank you for that, Sammy. All right, Brian, I want to come back to you because this is something I've been thinking a lot about. We're seeing these constant attacks on public education. We're hearing all this nonsense with voucher schemes running amok in our state, over and over and over again. And our teachers and our support staff have been on the front lines during this pandemic, trying to make sure that our young people are educated, trying to make sure that our kids are taken care of, and getting virtually no support from these school districts, from the state, from the federal government, right? It's been a lot, and it's always been a lot for our teachers and our support staff and our educators. But I think now it's gotten even worse, and it's so toxic right now. So how are our educators coping right now? And what kind of support do our educators and support staff need from all of us?
We need to stop the insanity, just to be cast a wide net on what we need to do. The educators are really suffering, and when I say educators, I mean our support staff, I mean our administrators, I mean folks in the central office, I mean teachers, I mean counselors, everyone. And so one of the things that when I'm asked this type of question is realize that there is an intense pressure and anger and outrage focused at every level of schools, especially public schools. And so it's not just the teacher that's suffering in their classroom and then a parent comes in or tries to attack them. That is also happening to the building administrator. It's also happening to the school secretary. It's also happening to our bus drivers who are required by federal mandate to have masks on their bus. Even now, when, with the change in Nevada's situation, school buses are transportation under federal law. And so the bus drivers are still going to have to enforce the mask mandate. And I don't want to comment anything on up, down, sideways on that. But what I'm saying is everyone is under attack. And so when we say, oh my gosh, we need support, there is no one within the system that really has the strength to support. And that's really the issue. And I think that is the intent of some of these groups, is to keep up the attack and the barrage at such a steady pace and at so many levels that everyone has to give up. There's nowhere to lean. And so quite frankly, the educators are not, they're not being supported. And we are working at it every day to try and explore and find ways. But a free yoga session or a Hershey's Kiss in your mailbox is not going to solve it. Systematically, we need to change where the pressure points are and the emphasis on what we do in schools. We have these accountability measures that have been co-opted and turned into ways to punish educators all across the board. And so principals and school site administrators feel this pressure. We have to get the scores. We have to increase this. And so then that goes to the teachers, it goes to the parents in the room. The students feel it because there is the joy of learning and the joy of teaching has been, it's been sucked out of the system. And so when we have a high stakes test and we get a number and we publish that and we assign stars to schools and we assign numbers to teachers, there is no way we can have a system that is about meeting students where they are, about getting students from here to here, or meaning wherever they start and need to get to. There is no place for empathy, for love. And that's the real root of it, is this, it was started with accountability decades ago. And this is where we've gotten, because the accountability is proof to these groups that public schools are failing. But when you set up a system, if everyone has to run a 4-minute mile, I'm a former runner, to meet the standard, it's not possible. Okay, that's the small fraction of society. Well, then you change it. Say, okay, well, everybody needs to run, a 6-minute mile, but there are people that come from all different backgrounds and cannot ever, and some that could do it, the day they enter kindergarten. So those things don't make sense. And I do want to point out one thing, and we have a great partner in a lot of things with Sylvia Lazos, and she pointed out a tweet yesterday that pointed out failures of the Clark County School District, and the what was implied is the 20% of the students met math standards, and the year before it was 40 or 50. I don't remember the exact numbers, but that whole system of testing is set up to destroy the public school system. And I'm not trying to defend Dr. Jara or any particular administrator, but it is impossible to expect that anyone was going to meet these artificially high benchmarks when we had a pandemic, when students were learning from home, learning different, learning other, but the tests were the same. And then the testing environment was ridiculous. And so to put it all together, there is a movement funded by big money people, including the Koch brothers and others, to systematically peck at public schools and other public entities and destroy them. And this is where we are 20, 30 years later.
And it is well documented. This is not something that's new.
No.
This effort to privatize our education system and make money off of our young people and make money off of our schools is well documented under the Koch brothers, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and all of these other, right-wing groups. This is a whole thing. And I know
Right.
I sound like the guy with the red string, up on a board, but it's real. This is real.
Yeah, well, to go back to the article that was in the local paper yesterday or the day before, just to publish as a shock headline, students that meet the standards drop 20%, and certain communities are even lower. Shame on them. They know why. It was pure shock value and pure driving of this destruction of the system, and it's one of the things that NSA that we work on every single day to write and correct and get the right message out and try and support our members and all educators and every student, but it's a heavy lift.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Brian. So the last thing I want to talk about very quickly is, Sammy, I want to bring you in. Speaking of folks who have been under attack the past year and a half, the ACLU recently honored Clark County Registrar Joe Gloria at your banquet on Friday evening, which I was at. And what Mr. Gloria and his amazing team at the Clark County Registrar did during the 2020 election, he earned this award. His entire staff earned this award with all of the nonsense and garbage that they had to put up with from these folks with conspiracy theories that just are not true. I've literally seen the election counting myself. Anybody can go watch, by the way. So what could other states learn from his administration of our elections? Because it is top notch, regardless of what the right-wing wackos want to say. His election administration is top notch. Our election system in Nevada, which, by the way, is run by a Republican Secretary of State right now, is top notch. Why is it so important, A, to protect our election officials and to have their backs and support them? But also, why is it so important for us to be seen as a model when it comes to our elections?
So I'm fairly new to Nevada, so I haven't had a chance to work very closely with Mr. Gloria, but I did meet him at our annual event, the one you attended as well. And based on the things I learned from my colleagues about him and things I've read about, I think his actions during the election were, just to put it plain, they were heroic. And that, he faced threats to his life, to his safety. He had to be escorted out by security. He was harassed on multiple occasions. And despite all that, he was still able to basically defend democracy and defend these blatantly false attacks and administer an election that was honest. And I think looking at that and the things he did to make sure that our elections were secured despite all this, I think other states can learn from that, because it's not succumbing to that pressure. It's making sure that the right thing is done. And that's what he did. He faced his adversaries. He did the right thing. And I think he received the Liberty in Government Award. And I think it was very well deserving, based on what I heard about him.
And Noah, I want to bring you in. You and I, with Emily, have worked with Mr. Gloria for a very long time to ensure that all people have the right to vote, regardless of their party. And that, we have free and fair elections in the state of Nevada, because Mr. Gloria is nonpartisan, contrary to popular belief. And he will, support all the parties, making sure that they have the right to vote. So what can we be doing to support our election workers, our poll workers? And why is that so important in a time like this, Noe?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we can be doing is just using that platform, whatever the platform is, right, to uplift these amazing individuals, and also calling out whenever there is the false narrative, the false accusations. Just because I had mentioned on this me in this call already, right? I was focusing mostly on redistricting, but I did reach out to Mr. Gloria to ask like, hey, how is redistricting impacting your work? And I didn't get a message. I didn't get an assistant. Like, he returned my call and he said, what is it that you need? And he was able to answer the questions to the best of his knowledge. It was really about the timeline, right? Because at that point we didn't have the special session that had been called, but he was telling me like, look, based on the information that I have, here's what we're looking at. And so, it was just, he was very transparent in everything that he was doing. And he is just one of the individuals in that office. And I think he eloquently expressed it too at that banquet, saying, that he is just one of the individuals in part of that, the entire office. But also, up in Washoe County, we also have a pretty good relationship with his counterpart up there. And so I think, just really uplifting them whenever they are doing good, like, they did in this last election, but also just, going to their back whenever there are these bad, these false accusations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I want to wrap it up, just final thoughts. Obviously, we've covered a lot of ground this evening. There's a lot of good stuff, like I said, on our ballot this year, important stuff, at the top of the ticket with all of the candidates and things like that, different races, like the Secretary of State's race, the governor's race, the Senate race. But there's also going to be all this bad stuff, potentially, if it qualifies on the ballot. A lot of these still have to get qualified. So hopefully they just don't qualify or see the light of day. Fingers crossed. That's what we want. So Noe, final words on this, and how do people pay attention to this and understand what's on their ballot?
Sure. So I think one of the things that they do is that they follow you and IPN and all these other great organizations that are on this panel, because it is going to be very evolving, right? So there's a lot happening, and there is going to be, as Mr. Bryan had mentioned earlier, right, where they're going to really try to get these these individuals, these stories, where they're going to just get you to be very passionate about an issue, whether one way or another. And it might be entirely, in the exact, like, sideways. So just really following a lot of these organizations that are, at the forefront of it, just trying to provide you the information, not telling you, swaying you one way or another, just saying, here's what's going to be happening. And if you vote in favor of this ballot initiative, here's what the process looks like. Because a lot of other actors are going to be looking at trying to sway you in one direction or another. And they could potentially leave out some information, or it could be even misleading. Like with this final five, a lot of talk has been talking about open primaries, and it is a little bit misleading to say that that's what it is, which is why, I think it's appropriate that you had said it was, the final five voting. And so I just think it's a matter of really trying to follow along these organizations to ensure that, we are getting the most up-to-date and accurate information.
And Noe, I'm just going to plug, we have voter guides coming out. We do a voter guide for all the candidates, but we also, on the BBP side, do a voter guide for all of the ballot initiatives that qualify and are on the ballot. Again, these haven't qualified yet. Some of the other good ones have. And so we'll have a ballot guide on all of these, so you all know what's coming and what's going to be on the ballot. So obviously keep tuning into what we do.
Yes. And if I may, Annette,
yep.
On that guide, whatever the candidates respond, you basically cut and paste. It's not like, hey, let's try to spruce it up a little bit. Whatever they provide, you're going to just go ahead and put that on there and say, candidate A said this verbatim. So, I think it's important to also highlight that.
Yes, spelling errors and all will be included. And that is not because of my staff. That is because candidates don't know how to spell. Okay, Brian, I want to bring you in. Final thoughts on this voucher scheme that they're promoting, or anything else you just want to get off your chest tonight, Brian, since you're our friends over at NSEA.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'll just end with, be very wary of anyone who wraps themselves in freedom or claims to be the defender of freedom. They're up to something, up to no good, and they are not working in the public's best interest. And this freedom to parent or freedom to choose in education stuff is a perfect example.
Couldn't have said it better myself. My dad always said, if something is too good to be true, it probably is. So pay attention, folks. All right, Sammy, you get the final word tonight as our new guest, hopefully a returning guest. I hope you had fun. What do you want to leave our viewers with all of the different topics that we spoke about tonight, but also in your new role as the voter protection attorney with the ACLU?
Thank you, Annette, for having me on. I think the first step to anything is just having discussions about what is going on. So this discussion, I think, fuels the need to understand what's going on, especially around the time of elections. I think Noe pointed out a huge issue that we're having, especially in this day and age where a lot of information is thrown our way. And a lot of that information is disinformation that is not correct and is made to basically steer people in the wrong direction. And I think if you follow organizations like Silver State Voices, if you go on our website on aclunv.org, we record the things we do. They put out information. This is nonpartisan information. It's not one way or another. It is to inform all the people and everyone of what is going on this election cycle. What can you do? And if you want information, correct information, this is where you can go and get it. So I think one is having the discussions, and two is being informed the correct way. And I'm very excited as on my new role. I think it's going to be great. I've already spoke and connected with so many other organizations that I know will be imperative in our fight, and just making sure that we do our best to protect everyone's right to vote. And I can't wait to see what happens this election cycle.
Yeah, it's going to be wild. Well, we are excited to have you on our team, Sammy. Thank you for all you do. Just so everybody knows at home, we will put the contact information for all of the different organizations on tonight in the chat, like always, so you all can get involved with them. We also put the link that Noe talked about earlier, so you can get involved doing poll watching and things like that. So fill out that link. And it's all in the chat, and we want you to get involved with NSEA, the Nevada State Education Association, ACLU, Silver State Voices, and obviously all of the work we do together. So thank you to our guests tonight. I just want to plug, we will be talking more about all of this during the Progressive Summit at the end of the month, February 26th and 27th. Because we believe COVID is still real, we are doing that summit online. So it's all virtual. So anyone across the state can join us, and we will be doing it virtually on February 26th and 27th. So in the chat on all the different streams, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, we'll have the link so you can get your tickets now. You are not going to want to miss this. In the next couple of days, we're going to be rolling out all the panels. We're going to be rolling out our big keynote speakers. We're going to have a couple of them. I'm super excited about them. You are not going to want to miss this year. It's going to be awesome. And we have many of our favorite folks from out in front who will be on panels during the Progressive Summit. So get your ticket now. Also, if you need a scholarship, we will put the scholarship link in the chat as well, and you can get a scholarship. That's why we do fundraising, is so we can make sure everybody who wants to attend the summit can. So either fill out the link to get a ticket or fill out the scholarship link now. Make sure you're getting your tickets early so you reserve your space, and you get a free swag bag in the mail if you get a ticket now. Plus, there's going to be a special running in the next couple of days that Shelby's putting together on our team. So you can get a free sticker for Valentine's Day if you get your Progressive Summit tickets. So lots of fun stuff coming up. You're not going to want to miss it. In addition to that, I just want to close tonight by saying, one of my friends, my mentors, Assemblyman, now Judge, Speaker Jason Frierson, always says it should be easier to vote than to go get a pizza or a hot dog at a Costco. And so we should not be going backwards on education. We should not be going backwards on voting. We should be going forward and making it easier to get that hot dog or that piece of pizza. So just want you to keep that in mind as you're thinking about all these ballot initiatives that are going to be on your ballot this year, potentially. So remember, if you see something in the community, if somebody tells you to sign something in the community about one of these ballot initiatives, think twice before you sign it and make sure you know what you're signing before you do. So thank you again for joining us. We'll be back out in front with you next Thursday evening at 5 p.m., just like always. And we'll have amazing guests for you next week as well. Make sure you get your summit tickets, and despite what people say, I'm still going to keep wearing a mask. So talk to you soon, everyone. Be safe.